The War on Waste. On September 10, 2001, Donald Rumsfeld announces $2.3 trillion missing from Pentagon. The next day was 9/11. It was never mentioned again. On September 10, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld declared war. Not on foreign terrorists, the adversaries closer to home. It's the Pentagon bureaucracy, he said. He said money wasted by the military poses a serious threat. In fact, it could be said it's a matter of life and death, he said. Rumsfeld promised change, but the next day, September 11th, the world changed, and in the rush to fund the war on terrorism, the war on waste seems to have been forgotten. Just last week President Bush announced, "My 2003 budget calls for more than $48 billion in new defense spending." More money for the Pentagon, CBS News correspondent Vince Gonzalez reports, while its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it spends. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions, Rumsfeld admitted. That was early in President George W. Bush's first term. Now fast forward towards the end of President Barack Obama's second term to this headline. Pentagon can't account for $6.5 trillion of taxpayer money, IG report. The Pentagon failed to account for $6.5 trillion in its financial statement, a recently recovered Inspector General's report on the 2015 fiscal year said. It reveals the audit of the Department of Defense was materially misstated. The Army failed to provide accurate, complete, timely and well-supported documents that could have explained the use of trillions of dollars in quarterly and year-end adjustments. The U.S. military made $2.8 trillion in wrongful adjustments in one quarter alone in 2015, and $6.5 trillion for the year, but could not provide anything that would detail what it spent the money on. There were a total of 64,321 journal voucher adjustments made in the third quarter and 142,355 by the year-end, but only 7,083 of them were supported with detailed documentation of transactions. The IG has also found that 16,513 of 1.3 million records were removed from the Pentagon's budget system during the third quarter of the 2015 fiscal year. Without support for why these records were removed, we could not determine whether the records continued valid transactions, the IG said, adding that the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, Indianapolis, could not explain why the files were removed. At the same time, data that Army General Fund cited in its financial reports in both the third quarter and year-end were unreliable and lacked an adequate audit trail, which are necessary to confirm accuracy, completeness and timeliness of transactions, the Department of Defense Inspector General found. These first two robberies of the American taxpayers went so well, without anyone noticing, that committing a third massive robbery, even bigger, would be too tempting and too easy to pass up. $21 trillion of unauthorized spending by U.S. government discovered by economics professor. The U.S. government may have misspent $21 trillion. A professor at Michigan State University has found. Papers supporting the study briefly went missing just as an audit was announced. Two departments of the U.S. federal government may have spent as much as $21 trillion on things they can't account for between 1998 and 2015. At least that's what Mark Skidmore, a professor of economics at MSU specializing in public finance, and his team have found. They came up with the figure after digging the websites of Departments of Defense and Housing and Urban Development, as well as reports of the Office of the Inspector General over summer. The research was triggered by Skidmore hearing Catherine Austin Fitts, a former assistant secretary in the HUD in the first Bush administration, saying the Inspector General found $6.5 trillion worth of military spending that the DoD couldn't account for. She was referring to a July 2016 report by the OIG, but Skidmore thought she must be mistaking billion for trillion. Based on his previous experience with public finances, he thought the figure was too big even for an organization as large as the U.S. military. Sometimes you have an adjustment just because you don't have adequate transactions. So an auditor would just recede. Usually it's just a small portion of authorized spending, maybe 1% at most. So for the Army 1% would be $1.2 billion of transactions that you just can't account for, he explained in an interview with USAWatchdog.com earlier this month. After discovering that the figure was accurate, he and Fitts collaborated with a pair of graduate students to comb through thousands of reports of the OIG dating back to 1998, when new rules of public accountability for the federal government were set, and all the way to 2015, the time of the latest reports available at the time. The research was only for the DoD and the HUD. This is incomplete, but we have found $21 trillion in adjustments over that period. The biggest chunk is for the Army. We were able to find 13 of the 17 years, and we found about $11.5 trillion just for the Army, Skidmore said. The professor would not suggest whether the missing trillions went to some legitimate undisclosed projects, wasted or misappropriated, but believes his find indicates that there is something profoundly wrong with the budgeting process in the U.S. federal government. Such lack of transparency goes against the due process of authorizing federal spending through the U.S. Congress, he said. Skidmore also co-authored a column on Forbes, explaining his research. The same week the interview took place, the DoD announced that it will conduct its first-ever audit. It is important that the Congress and the American people have confidence in DoD's management of every taxpayer dollar, Comptroller David Norquist told reporters as he explained that the OIG has hired independent auditors to dig through the military finances. While we can't know for sure what role our efforts to compile original government documents and share them with the public has played, we believe it may have made a difference, Skidmore commented. Interestingly, in early December the authors of the research discovered that the links to key document they used, including the 2016 report, had been disabled. Days later the documents were reposted under different addresses, they say.